Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. So this is a US political update. I've got an awful lot of content to deliver today. I've got a video on Venezuela I want to do. I've got a video on the geopolitics around Ukraine still to do, geopolitical news. I've got a mapping update I want to do too. I'm going to talk about reform and Brexit, and we're going to talk about Brexit again, and I'll explain why. I have been criticised previously by Leave voters in terms of talking too much about Brexit, and my position is that, and I stated this as much in 2016 when I debated this publicly a couple of times down in Bournemouth, but I stated, look, you cannot, if you're a Leave voter, you cannot win the economic argument. You just can't. We are going to lose money from coming out of the EU. We're going to have to renegotiate something like 70 trade deals, maybe more, with nations and conglomerates around the world, and they will be weaker deals than we were able to negotiate from within one of the biggest trade bloc in the world. So we've gone from a power position whereby all of our trade deals are very well negotiated by the EU. And we, as part of the EU, got the best deal there. And we've come out of that, and we've got to renegotiate now with bigger entities that are bigger than us, like the US, the EU themselves, Japan, economically is a powerhouse. And even when we did a trade deal with Australia and New Zealand, they did us over. We got a poor deal out of it. And you're like, how did that happen? So economically, we're going to lose. We have to now pay tariffs to access 500 million people, and we try and attract inward investment by saying, hey, you can come and set up shop in the UK, but you'll have to pay tariffs to access 500 million people. Whereas when we're in the EU, we could attract people to the UK to say, you can come and set up shop in the UK and you'll be able to access 570 million people free of charge, as in, there are no tariffs. Now, if you want to set up shop here, if you're an American company, you want to set up in the UK, and trade into the closest neighbours here, into the EU, you're going to have to pay tariffs to do that. And so that American company is going to be like, well, I set up in Germany, thank you very much. Why would I set up in the UK to pay to access 500 million when I can set up in the EU and pay to access only 70 million, but actually get free access to 500 million? So we are going to struggle to get inward investment, and that is clearly the case. So the point is that I've been saying stuff like this, but okay, you can win the immigration argument in terms of if you're a Leave voter, fair enough. But actually, the reality was that that wasn't even one, because we ended up having worse immigration as a result of leaving the EU. So we said, right, we don't want all these Europeans moving around the UK through freedom of movement or coming into the UK. So we're going to leave the EU, and then the Conservative government negotiated themselves into a position whereby we were taking in way more East Asian immigrants, particularly through student visas and then on to work visas and family visas and so on and so forth. And our migration absolutely exploded. Immigration exploded. And it was not European people, it was people from outside the EU. And if you were worried about immigration before, well, you're even more worried about it now. Hence the kind of Unite the Kingdom marches. But many of the people on the Unite the Kingdom marches were Leave voters, were like, that's what you got. Okay, so anyway, people criticise me for spending too much time talking about Brexit and saying, hey, it's been and gone, it's done, stop whinging about it. I'm like, no, it's still really important. If we don't understand how we got here, then we can't really know the best solutions for solving the problems of here. You really do need to look into history to understand the now and to have a better idea of what's going on. But also, it's becoming more and more prevalent. More and more people are talking about it. So I think really what happened, cognitive dissonance with many viewers who are probably Leave voters who didn't want to hear about how Brexit hasn't been so successful. So you have your core belief, this is cognitive dissonance, core belief and evidence against that belief, and they come into a dissonant relationship in your brain, and you have to do something about this because you can't have dissonance. So if you're like, I'm a Leave voter, JP keeps talking about why Brexit sucked, and like I need to deal with this. So either I bury that, so please don't talk about it, right, I hold my core belief, or I argue it and some of the information gets assimilated, or whatever. But you generally don't lose your core belief. You very rarely change your mind with core beliefs, unfortunately. That's just the nature of the beast with the human psyche. And so what I think people are doing was saying, look, stop talking about it because I don't want you to talk about it because it's uncomfortable for me to hear it. Okay. Now, why am I talking about all this now? Because actually in the UK, it is now being not relitigated, but it's coming up more and more and more in the press, in the public discourse with regard to the cost of Brexit to our economy. So, for example, the Brexit impact on UK economy, quotes, negative for the foreseeable future, says the Bank of England chief. So the bank's governor, Andrew Bailey, said for nearly a decade he had been careful to, quote, take no position on Brexit. But when asked directly about its impact on economic growth, he, quote, had to answer the question. In other words, it was such a hot potato. No one wanted to talk about it. No one during particularly the Conservative years, no one wanted to talk about how it was really bad for the economy, because anyone associated with the government had to be pro-Brexit, because the Conservative government were kind of campaigning on get Brexit done, get Brexit done. Boris Johnson was the big lever. And so you couldn't really be in the Conservative Party and be an outspoken Remainer. And so if you're the Bank of England chief, selected by the Conservative government, then you're going to be like, but you listen to Mark Carney, who's now the Prime Minister of Canada. He was a Bank of England chief before that, right? That was his job before. And you listen to him talk about Brexit now, and he will tell you outright that Brexit was a bad idea for the UK economy. So you're starting to hear this being mentioned more and more, precisely because our economy is really, really struggling. So here we have one source saying, look, on the left of this particular video here, you've got Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor at Exchequer. Now, so she repeatedly said before Labour were elected that Labour will not take us back into the EU, the single market, or even a customs union. So you have these different levels of EU. You get the 4 pillars of free movement of Labour, so free movement of people, services, capital, product, money, whatever. Free movement of stuff is a neoliberal. It's actually a free market arrangement. That's why you have free movement of people. It's nothing to do with some ideology that, we all want to be one big, nice, happy family. No, it's a neoliberal enterprise. And here's the funny thing, this is a free market principle that you are going to be able to compete better with outside people, with outside agencies, if you have the free movement, all these things within a trade bloc. You don't want to put barriers to entry, barriers to markets, barriers to anything. You want to take barriers away. So that's why you have free movement. It is purely an economic ideal. So there are other things you can have, like a single market, customs union. So we can have some access to the European market if we come into the single market, or this, so on and so forth. Customs union, so our customs, we have customs agreements, so on and so forth. The Labour will try and make Brexit work, but now you're starting to see them understand that Brexit is really costing us an awful lot of money. So on the right here, Labour can't make Brexit work because any version of Brexit causes long-term damage to the UK economy. And there's a point. So you've got a Labour Party who's in government now saying, well, we didn't want to campaign on rejoining the EU because we knew we wouldn't be able to attract many of the Labour voters, the working class Labour voters who voted against the EU, voted for Brexit. We lost them. We've gained some of them back, although Reform are now there, and we're going to talk about that relationship in a second. And now we've got some of them back. If we then go hard on rejoining the EU, we're going to lose them, and so we need to be really careful with that. But now the stats are coming out, it's looking really problematic. So since the UK left the EU, and there are different figures on this, the UK has lost £200 billion in taxes from trade. So there's like loss of some claims of £450 billion in terms of economic activity. There's just huge numbers. Stuff that, like, if you had that much money, so if you said to the UK government now, here's £200 billion, you'd be like, won the lottery, this is amazing, that solves all our problems, we can help Ukraine out crazily, we can do this, we can do that, we can get yourselves out of a black hole, and we can repay some of the deficit and or some of our debt, so on and so forth. How many public services would £200 billion pay for? The only one celebrating the breakup is Putin, who has succeeded in making the UK and Europe poorer and weaker. So here it says the EU has lost £250 billion in taxes from trade. So you are starting to see this being talked about more and more in the in public and on television, in the media, questions about it on panel shows and whatnot. This is someone. This is, I presume, a Conservative politician there with a Remainer here, a pro-EU commentator on Politics Live on the BBC.
Alex, do you accept that Brexit has damaged the economy?
Well, I found it very interesting that you had two representatives.
By the way, that's a yes or no. Doesn't answer yes or no. Do you accept? Blah 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 blah. So always worth remembering always worth understanding when someone doesn't answer a closed question. Closed question is yes or no. If you answer a closed question with an open answer, it means you don't want to answer the closed question because it's too uncomfortable for you to do so.
Businesses who've been negatively affected by Brexit, but hadn't got.
Do you have lots in your constituency?
Yeah,
who
of
found
course,
it a positive
because
experience?
some people have made money out of it. But the reason we're talking about this right now, everyone can come up with their own figures, but right now, the British economy has ground to a halt because of what the Chancellor did last November.
OK, right, I've got two people trying to come in here. Naomi first.
Well, I mean, it's fantasy economics to suggest anything other than the fact that leaving the single market has detrimentally impacted our economy. The businesses that we heard from, I have heard from thousands and thousands over the last decade that we've been looking into this at Best for Britain. And finally, what we're seeing now is political discourse finally catching up with the economic reality.
That's really the point of this video, right? In a way, well, it's half-half. It's going to be half about reform, but half about, there is this situation now where the economic reality of Brexit is catching up with the public discourse, and you're now starting to see opinions shift on this. And so if you're to criticise me and say, look, you're talking too much about Brexit, it was like, actually, no, I'm not. I'm talking about it in reflection to how much it is turning up in public discourse. And in fact, I'm going to show you some polling in a second, which is very bad news for kind of Leave sentiments.
For the last 10 years, we've had successive governments try to tell us what a great thing Brexit is, how it's going to supercharge the economy, how we're going to get it done and everyone's going to feel the benefit of it. Well, our polling done by YouGov shows that nearly 2/3 of people think that Brexit has been more of a failure than a success. Businesses know it's hurt them. Consumers know that they're paying more at the checkout, more to heat their homes, and finding it more difficult to travel. It is, because we have become less trade intensive.
It's not why we have the highest inflation in the G7. It's not to do with Brexit.
It has compounded it. The word Rachel Reeves used was compounded.
So
And I would argue that she's absolutely right here. So some of these problems aren't entirely Brexit, but what Brexit has done is that because everything is more expensive, it compounds all these problems. So when you've got energy issues, I could bore you with what happened when we came out of energy price arrangements with Europe, but just by point of fact that any goods imported from Europe are more expensive, and any goods exported from the UK to Europe are more expensive for Europeans, and so therefore we are less competitive, means that it's inflationary, and we are double whammy hit, and that just exacerbates all the existing problems.
Alex, just let me speak. You had a really good rant.
I'll let you have yours.
Thank you. Nobody is saying that all of our economic ills are as a consequence of Brexit. But anyone with any sense knows that Brexit has compounded each of those things. It's why the government is doing the right thing to get an SPS deal that should eventually help us bring down supermarket prices. It's why they're hoping to do a scheme on emissions trading to hopefully make it cheaper to heat our homes. And they need to go further and do alignment on a range of other industries to free up all of that trade friction that we heard about earlier from those businesses. It is finally the political discourse catching up with the economic reality.
Alex, what do you say?
It is, yeah, exactly. And it kind of finishes after that. He says, oh, you're just distracting things away from the problem over here. But no, I think this is absolutely on point. Now, here, as Tim Walker says, what beggars belief is that the perpetrator of this act of national self-harm sees himself as our next Prime Minister. This is Nigel Farage, which he is a guy largely responsible for what happened with Brexit. And he's in line to be the next Prime Minister. And that's where we're going to go after sort of talking about this. So this is some new data that is out to suggest that actually a vast majority of people now, it's like 2/3 to a third, or give or take, not quite that, but there'll be others, people who who aren't sure, but we have something like 56% maybe there of people think it was wrong to leave the EU, and something like 32% think it was right to leave the EU. And so those figures have really, really changed since. You can see in 2017 there, it took over shortly afterwards where wrong to leave, people were realizing quite quickly that actually Brexit wasn't going to be these sunlit uplands of Elysium fields that were promised by people like Nigel Farage. We have buses saying £350 million a week can be spent on the NHS from Brexit. It's like, no, that's never going to happen, and it didn't happen, and it's all a load of rubbish. And so all of these promises from the Leave campaign never came through. And all of the doom, all the fear mongering, as was accused at the time, all the fear mongering from Remainers has actually come through. It's just a lot later than people were initially thinking, because actually these things take a long time to have effect. So we didn't really come out the EU for many years after that, and then we were trying to negotiate what kind of Brexit we were going to have, whether it's going to be a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit, so on and so forth. And so it's only recently, sort of since 2020 probably, that the real impact of Brexit has been felt. So we were never really going to feel it from 2016 to 2020, and then after that things have got gradually worse, and now economically we are definitely feeling some suffering there. Now, interesting, Ollie Dugmore, who is Politics Joe, although he's kind of left there now, he's doing stuff with New Statesman and whatnot, but he's talking about, hey, we went and interviewed a load of people in the Calais jungle. So the Calais jungle is the other side of the English Channel, where loads of migrants that want to get to the UK go and hang around, hoping to jump on trucks that then got onto ferries and whatever, and then get across to the UK, or try and go across on boats and whatnot. Now, when we were in the EU, of course, we had agreements with France because we were all part of the EU, and this was less of a problem. But now that there's a hard border there, France has no interest particularly in trying to sort out migrants, trying to stop migrants going from France to the UK. And this is one of the issues of getting out of the EU, is that actually we are now less able to work with France on the problem of migrants congregating in, say, Calais. Anyway, Ollie Dugmore went and interviewed a bunch of these migrants in Calais, and the idea is that people think that the UK is some kind of easy end game for all the migrants. And quite often you hear these ideas that we are everyone that's migrating to Europe is actually really trying to migrate to the UK. Oh, woe is us, it's terrible. And that's how it's kind of sold in the national media. When you look at the figures, actually, the asylum seeker stats are much worse in Germany, France and Italy, and Spain even, I think, as well. So, they have much greater challenges in the UK. People come to the UK primarily probably because of English language, which you would go to the, and that's a legacy of our imperial past, right? We went around the world sticking our flags in different countries and saying, this is our country now. You don't have a flag, we do, bosh. And then a couple of hundred years later, people try and move to the country where they speak the same language, but, where there's affluence and aspiration, or the ability to fulfill your aspirations. So you get these economic migrants wanting to come to the UK because there's less barrier to getting a job. You speak the same language, you've got the shared history through the British Empire, so on and so forth. And so a lot of them will come to the UK for those reasons. But actually, the rest of Europe has those problems too. And it isn't necessarily the case that everyone's trying to get to the UK. Anyway, why are they trying to get to the UK since Brexit? Well, Ollie Dugmore says this.
Interestingly, the New Statesman cover last week, we had a long-form reported feature from northern France, from this place called Loon Plage, which is essentially the new Calais jungle. Nearly every single one of the irregular migrants that was interviewed for that piece listed the fact the UK was no longer part of the European Union, and therefore the Dublin Agreement did not apply, was one of the reasons that they were coming here. Only one of them mentioned the one-in, one-out deal that the Labour Party is parroting right now. I think it tells you a lot about the motivations. Interesting.
So they were actually trying to come to the UK because of the sorry, I didn't realise I was on big screen. So you can look at some of these different sources in larger text now. That's what I was referring to earlier, that source. And indeed, if you want to look at the graph there from the Financial Times by the look of it. But yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so going back to Ollie Dugmore. So he's saying that, interestingly, people wanting to come to the UK precisely because we're out of the EU, and we are not signatories, or we're not part of the Dublin Agreement. That is the Dublin regulation, a European Union law that determines which member state is responsible for examining an asylum application. It is based on a system of rules and criteria, usually making the country where the asylum seeker first entered the EU responsible, but with exceptions for family ties, previous applications, or other links. The regulation has been updated multiple times, and the most recent version being Dublin 3, implemented in 2014. In other words, you can kind of send them back to the country they first came to if you're within the EU. So, for example, if the migrants came to the UK from Spain up through France and then to the UK, we could, their asylum application has to be done in Spain, right? But that's not the case now, because we're not in the EU, so we can't send them back to France, Spain, wherever. Or they're not obliged to take them if we tried, right? So that's an interesting development there. So they actually want to come to the UK precisely because we're not in the EU. So there you go. So anyway, the idea is that Brexit is back on the agenda because it is having such a massive economic impact on us. Right, okay. We're now going to go to Reform, because Reform are the latest manifestation or latest iteration of UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, Brexit Party, then Reform. And they are still predominantly in the mindset that they are an anti-immigration, anti-EU, kind of Remain party, if you like. But they also understand that they've attracted people from both the left, the working class left usually, and the right as well. Predominantly the right, but there's some interesting diagrams where you can look at how... In fact, I might go and find one for you. Yeah, this is quite a good one. This is the one I was thinking about, actually, that shows you. So you've got left, right, which is a problematic spectrum anyway, but let's just take it for what it is. Left, centre, right spectrum here. Let's say Labour certainly were centre-left. I would argue they're now centrist. Conservatives on the right, Lib Dems just a little bit to the left of centre, SNP and the Greens. Now, below the green line is who voted for Remain in the EU, and you basically have all of the Lib Dems, pretty much all of the SNP in Scotland, all of the Greens who voted for a hard UK exit, which is let's get out of the EU, no deals, do nothing, we want to completely leave the EU. So all the UKIP wanting that, and then you had Conservative Brexiteers. These are a bigger group than in Labour Brexiteers. That's called Lexit, sort of a left-wing exit. There are admittedly more Conservatives who wanted to leave than Labour, but actually in terms of the there was a large amount of Labour people wanting, in fact 40% of Labour, 42% of Conservatives wanted a soft Brexit, which is we want to leave the EU but we want to do deals to remain associated with so we can get the economic benefit. That never happened in the end, right? So we got like the worst of the Brexits, where we just got completely stung by then having to attempt to renegotiate everything post facto. And then, some Labour Remainers and some Conservative Remainers. But essentially Labour were split quite a lot, which is why the Labour Party never had, and the Conservatives never had, a party whip or party line on Brexit, right? They said vote how you like, both as MPs, campaign how you like, but also as voters. Like Labour aren't saying you should stay in, and they knew they couldn't do that because they knew that the party was split and they were going to lose large elements from the party in to either camp. Same with the Conservatives, right? Some of the smaller parties did have a line. UKIP, obviously, and Lib Dems were very pro Remain. Anyway, so that's what happened. And the Reform Party are now in this situation whereby they have to. And I'm going to put myself back on full screen for a bit of analysis. So Reform now have to negotiate themselves to the next general election. So 3.5 years away. And Labour are trying to work out where to position themselves. And some are saying there's an interesting theory that Labour could adopt a rejoin the EU, because actually they're suffering in so many other ways. They're struggling to regain a narrative, and that could be a way to differentiate themselves from lots of others and say, right, actually, we're going to just campaign, just go for it, campaign on rejoin the EU. Don't think that would happen, but it could happen. Reform need to say, right, we need to get to the next election and we need to make Brexit work, but also recognise that in our broad tent that we have now, we have your conservative, big business, corporation, low tax people, like your conservative Brexiteers up here who wanted Brexit for ideological reasons, maybe to make money off of it, like Jacob Rees-Mogg making a lot of money off Brexit, but also wanting low regulation. You come out of the EU, we don't want any EU regulation. We want to make lots of money from this, and we want free market economics to work over here in this way, and we can strip all regulation away, strip environmental regulation out, and so on and so forth. But then you have the working class Labour lot, for example, voting for so these Labour Brexiteers up here voting for a hard Brexit, but actually what there may be union workers who want the nationalisation of the rail industry again. They want to renationalise the maybe, for example, the power or the water industries. And so Reform has attracted these working class unionised, often, I'm generalising here because there are lots of different demographics, but just to make the point here, say working class left-wing voters who were big on immigration, like we don't like immigrants, so we're going to vote Leave. And we're going to vote UKIP. We're now over in Reform, and Reform have to say, well, okay, so we've attracted you over, but we're not going to keep you if you're a union voter, and we want to get rid of unions, which is kind of what Reform would ideologically want to do, because Reform really are a right-wing faux libertarian. They pretend to be libertarian, but they're not at all. They are essentially a form of the Conservative Party, really. So there's this uncomfortable, and this is what we're going to talk about. There's a great Independent article here, how the cracks are beginning to show in Nigel Farage's Reform UK, partly because they are struggling with how to keep that broad tent together, right? That broad church together. Because on the one hand, they need a manifesto that appeals to those left-wing unionised voters or similar. And on the other hand, they've got those big conservative donors that are now backing Reform, who are pumping money into Reform so that there's deregulation, so that there's privatisation, so there's this and that. And those two voters are going to struggle to coexist under the same umbrella. And that is a real challenge. Okay. So what we're starting to see is some interesting polling coming out. So the good news for Reform is that they are doing really well in generic polling. So not much change. Our latest voting intention survey, though a couple of important points stand out beneath the surface. So Reform riding high on 31%, Labour around 21%, Conservatives down on 19%, Lib Dems on 13%, Greens on 9%. But that has been different, and I'll talk about that in a second. Reform's reached another record high with us, hitting 30% of the vote for the first time. As we noted last month, this is approaching overall majority territory given the current distribution of vote shares at our five-party system. Now everyone's talking about, oh, this is terrible, Reform are going to absolutely wipe the floor. If you look at how this will affect the number of seats, well, that whole map is looking Reform colour. There's a long time to the elections, don't you worry, and that's kind of the point of this video too. This is approaching overall majority territory. So Nigel Farage has also reached his highest net ever favourability rating with us at 36%. Though 42% still have an unfavourable view, this makes him comfortably the most popular national leader. Lots of discussions about, even though he's deeply unpopular, the most popular national leader, lots of discussion about reform's ceiling, but there's not necessarily a fixed spot. In other words, some people have been saying, look, there's this high ceiling that reform will never be able to get over because they're kind of unpopular, a bit like the talk with Donald Trump, right? That, okay, he's never going to get above here, though, in terms of his favourability or in terms of, the amount of voters. What you get is people in the middle that swing, one way or the other. So, but anyway, the talk of the ceiling isn't a fixed ceiling because actually it appears that ceiling might be shifting, and he is pretty popular, all things considered, given how divisive he is. Anyway, so stats are generally looking good for reform. There are some other interesting points of note, though. So, I mean, these are changing. This is one from the other day where you had Reform on 27, Greens were on 13 in that one. So, Lib Dems on 16. So, that's from a few days previously. These things change quite a bit. But I want to point out a couple of these polls for younger people. So we've got, first of all, we're going to look at 16 to 17 year olds, where Labour are ahead of Reform, which are ahead of your party. So your party is split off from Labour. So if you put your party together with Labour, actually that's 45% for 16 to 17 year olds. Now, your party, I think, are insane because they're splitting the left. And I know, lefties of the your party type would argue with me an awful lot about this, but essentially your party is gifting Reform electability or actual election results because they're splitting left hugely. So, but imagine that Sarah Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn hadn't defected from Labour Party and started up their new party. This would essentially be broadly put in the red column. So that's probably a huge advantage for the left in 16 to 17 year olds. 23% Reform, 13% for Conservatives, 12% for Lib Dems, only 6% for Green, which I find interesting. But then when you come to look at the age group above, so 18 to 24 year olds, the Green Party is absolutely cruising. Now, I don't think your party is included on this one. So the Green, and it looks like the Green might take a lot of the your party vote going forward because there's a lot of disaffection with how your party's been started. But anyway, you've got Green Party 30%, Labour 23%, Lib Dems 20%, Conservatives 11%, and for 18 to 24 year olds, Reform on 8%. Now, it depends. This is from YouGov, so you can look at methodology and argue, so on and so forth. There are going to be lots of different polls coming out saying different things, but essentially, and there was a video I didn't watch, but from a reputable source said Reform have a young person's problem, and I think that will be their challenge going forwards. Now, we're going to come to some of the problems Reform are going to be facing with regard to elections, because I will give you a bit of a heads up now that one of the issues is that when you do generic polling and you say who would you vote for, and they do this in the US with likely voters, registered voters, so on and so forth. But in the UK, like, you can just ask 1,000 people, and it turns out that that it's looking like 30% of Reform of people would vote Reform. But it turns out that many of the people who say they're going to vote Reform are the least likely to vote. So these are the least politically engaged people, and so don't automatically think that this transforms into 30% of votes, because it might well be that, say, for Conservative, you might have actually a much higher propensity for someone who's going to vote Conservative to actually go out and vote Conservative, rather than someone that says they're going to vote for Reform to actually get out of bed on election day and go and lodge that vote. So that can skew the data somewhat. Anyway, now what we're going to do is look at this idea that actually Reform could be in a slightly more not precarious, they're not in a precarious position, but there are some saying that this is going to be the high point for Reform, that actually they're going to have to put up with 3.5 years of trying to put together a serious manifesto, getting questioned far more robustly by the press, having scandals that come with having more power, and being found to be not as good as they promised to be prior to particularly local elections. So we're going to look at all of these points here. So how the cracks are beginning to show in Nigel Farage's Reform UK. Reform UK appears to have an impregnable lead in the polls, but political editor David Maddox highlights how the cracks are beginning to show in the councils the party runs and the ongoing policy vacuum. I've talked about this before, and we're going to start with the proving themselves in local government. So, and also in government themselves. So they have now 5 MPs, is it? They had 5, went down to 4, went back up to 5, went to 4, 5. So I think they've got 5 MPs now. And Nigel Farage, for example, is famous for not going to his surgeries. Surgeries for an MP, an elected member of parliament, is where you go and meet your constituents, you open your offices, they come in and you have people coming in and petitioning for this and that and saying, look, potholes are not good, or look what's going on here, what can you do about this? I've had this problem over here, blah, blah, blah. And you have a desk and they come and speak to you, and you speak to your constituents and you promise them that you're going to work on this, do that, and you allay their fears or whatever it is. Those are called surgeries. Nigel Farage doesn't turn up to any surgeries because he's not really interested in being an MP. He wants to be a prime minister. He wants to be a leader. He wants to be on TV. He wants to go to the United States and campaign at big rallies with Donald Trump and get all the adulation from big crowds of people. But he couldn't give a toss about actually doing the work of being a politician. So he doesn't care for these surgeries. Now, that might then show them to not be a serious political force if, starting at the top, they're not really that interested in running local services or representing local voters. Now, that's in central government, but then we had these local elections in May that I reported on you, where Reform absolutely, in some councils, so these local elections were only in England and they're only in some councils, so they happen at different times, but in the ones that were having their elections, Reform did exceptionally well, right? And they've taken control of a load of local councils: Kent, Durham, Northumberland, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, I think. They've taken control of these councils. And I said to you at the time, this is not a serious party. And by that, I was being quite technical. I wasn't just trying to have a go at them. As in, they're a party that are very, very obsessed about immigration, but local councillors have very little to do with immigration policy. That's a central government thing. So if you're voting your local councillor on because they're Reform UK and they've got a nice rosette and they're going around and they're wanging on about immigration, you think, yeah, bloody hate migration, I'm going to vote for you in my local council. So you vote for Jim Smith, who gets into the local council office as a councillor, gets into local council as a councillor, and he has to run adult services or children's services or transport or this or that, and you realise that they don't have any policy. Reform haven't developed a policy on all of these things yet. None of these people have got experience in local governance. They've got into this because they're so angry with immigration. They get voted in because the voters are angry about immigration. They're not in the local elections. Sadly, people don't generally these days vote on, like, I think you'll be good for filling in my potholes. They think, I think you're going to be, I'm going to vote in line with my national voting intentions for a local councillor. It's generally what people do. And so a load of these Reform councillors are being voted in. They're now controlling these councils. They're in charge of massive budgets. They don't have the experience, and they don't actually have the interest often either. And so when I said they're an unserious party, what I meant was they don't have the policy and they're not serious about governance. They don't care enough or have the knowledge enough to be able to run a local council significantly well. And then you had this idea that at the time, Elon Musk's Doge was in operation in the US, and Reform want to be the next iteration of, or they want to be the UK manifestation of MAGA. So, like, we're going to take Doge and we're going to have it over here. So you had, Kent County Council, they're going to go and we're going to save millions of pounds. We're going to cut this, cut that. And the reality was, or has been, that they promised that they were going to have council taxes go down, but instead council taxes in all of the Reform councils appear to be on the way up. Sorry to pause there, but didn't know where I was. So I don't know where I was. So talking about, councils, they had Doge, I think I was saying, that they were trying to copy and then bring them into these councils. But it turns out that actually the councils are running fairly efficiently. And these are big pots of money they're having to deal with, and they're not necessarily very well placed to be able to deal with these, as many of the councillors came in with a complete lack of experience. You've got like these young 18, 19-year-olds being put in charge of children and adult services and so on and so forth. So now the Times is reporting that out of 12 reform councils, 8 have said that they will be jacking up council charges, council tax, and the other 4 are expected to follow suit. It'll be 100% for a party that campaigned on reducing council taxes. They said, we're going to go in, we're going to make all these cuts, we're going to doge it, and it turns out that they are actually going to raise council taxes. It is pretty embarrassing for them. But it also shows how difficult running councils is, right? There was this Super Tuesday voting recently as well. Super Thursday, actually. Lib Dems came out the winners in some local council by-elections. They won 7 out of 10 local by-elections, and Reform won 1. So it's not going to be plain sailing for Reform, especially if they are going to be less able to be able to prove themselves as serious contenders when it comes to local governance. And in fact, this is really, really important. So Kent County Council, this was leaked the other day. Kent County Council, run by Reform, had this Reform councillor meeting where the Reform lead councillor was, it was just an absolute shit show. And this was leaked online. And now I think 4 of them have lost their positions at the moment, or this is all looking very, very bad for Reform. So Reform runs Kent County Council, and here is a team having a meeting. They must never be asked to run anything, let alone the country. This is Reform in office. Vote for anyone and any party that can block them, says Brendan May here. But the point is, and I'm not going to play you this, but it's one of these meetings where it's pretty embarrassing, and there's a lot of dissent, and the woman at the top is like, I've decided this, F the lot of you type thing. Anyway, this is exactly what I was talking about after the local council elections, is in saying that these are unserious people put into positions of serious governance, and both at the local level and I think at the national level. However, the challenge at the national level is that you're going to get a lot of defections from the Conservative Party. In fact, everyone who's an MP for Reform at the moment was either a former Conservative MP, a former Conservative mayor, or former Conservative donor. You basically are seeing Reform become the Conservative Party 2.0. So either they're an unserious party or they're just a reworking of the Conservative Party. And if it's the latter, then you have a lot of people who are sick and tired of the 14 years of the Conservative rule will not want to vote for a party that has just become another Conservative Party. So the idea that they're an unserious party in local governance is, I think, represented by this. Reform UK in Kent, which is the council that has had this meeting leaked. So they've lost 7 over 10% of their councillors since May. The leader, Lyndon Cameron's flagship Reform UK council is in chaos. 1 councillor suspended for threatening to kill his wife. 1 councillor suspended for making lewd comments against women. 1 councillor defected. 4 councillors suspended due to leaked video showing her poor leadership. And that was that video that you just saw. And it is just chaos there. There were talks about paralysis in, Kent County Council was one of them and Durham was the other, where they weren't turning up for meetings. And there was one councillor who was not from Reform saying this is ridiculous. Out of the 54 councillors in this particular council that were elected as Reform councillors, only 4 of them have got experience in governance. So 50 of them don't, and then so on and so forth. It was just an absolute... it was always going to be challenging because they would claim it's a nascent party. Reform would claim it's a nascent party, and that what do you expect from a new party? But actually, you should be going into being a councillor with the eyes wide open, knowing what a councillor entails, having the skills to be a councillor, and having the interest in being a councillor and working in particular areas. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So anyway, going back to this article in The Independent, I think it's interesting that their number one is proving themselves in government. Let us start with Kent, where Reform took over last May, promising to bring down council tax with their new Elon Musk-inspired Doge units. It said a lot about those Doge units run by former party chair Zia Yusuf, that they were recruiting video experts for online more than accountants. But Kent was the first council they took over with serious hopes they would slash spending. Now on the video, Councillor Kemkaren is admitting that she is struggling to find £2.5 billion of cuts and is still going to have to raise council tax. Her one hope is that they raise it less than the 5% maximum, which she told her fellow councillors was the main aim, not quite reducing people's council tax bills. And then, it's the idea that they were going to sack diversity DEI officers, again copying the US in places like Lincolnshire, but then it turns out that there is no such thing as DEI appointments, and it's all just like trying to take from America and institute that thinking over here, but it's not relevant for here necessarily. It's not looking good at the local level. The second interesting point here is a potential crack for Reform is their dependence on Nigel Farage. So many people are saying the party really is just Nigel Farage. You take Nigel Farage out of the party, and it's a bit like Trump and MAGA. So some people are saying that there is no one else that can replace Trump. If he was to get run over by a bus tomorrow, JD Vance couldn't run the Republican Party, couldn't run a government with the same control and the same loyalty committed by those in the Republican Party to Donald Trump. He just wouldn't be the leader that could arouse that kind of loyalty and excitement. Now, Nigel Farage is a really similar leader to Donald Trump for Reform UK in the UK. Without him, it fell, and you saw that with UKIP. As soon as he kind of left UKIP to go and do other things, and UKIP, it goes down, and then Brexit Party, and then Reform. So he joins, and then it's all great, and then he loses interest or whatever. It is all about him. As it says here, the fact is that Reform is the Nigel Farage party. It is a one-man team. So anyway, as it says here, but while Mr. Farage is a strength, he's also a weakness. A microscope is now being applied to those closest to him and surrounding him. We're going to look at this in a second. The picture is less than pretty. This weekend, it was revealed that Mr. Farage's French partner, Laure Ferrari, is at the heart of a fraud investigation in Brussels. The investigation is related to a former role as executive director of the Institute for Direct Democracy in Europe, a think tank based in the Belgian capital, which auditors refused to sign off spending of hundreds of thousands of euros of public funds in 2016. But it's not only her. Reform's former Welsh leader Nathan Gill, a longtime friend and ally of Mr. Farage, has just been found guilty of taking Russian-linked bribes. And Gill from Llangefni, Anglesey, pleaded guilty last month to 8 counts of bribery between December 2018 and July 2019, while some, including the pollster and commentator Matthew Goodwin, believe that this is just an attempt to throw mud at Farage. Eventually, if there's enough of it, the mud begins to stick. Politicians embroiled in scandals tend to struggle to get mass support they need to win. Ask Marine Le Pen in France. But without Mr. Farage, Reform's support is likely to nosedive. This is really important. So he was accusing Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK and Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, of tax evasion and whatnot. And then it turns out that he bought a house in Clacton in his constituency because he said he was accused of not having anything to do with Clacton. So he went and bought a house, said, right, I bought a house, what more do you want me to do? And it turns out that he hasn't bought it. It was Laure Ferrari who bought it. But then if she bought it with his money, because he didn't buy it, because then he would have had to pay, because he's already got 5 houses, he would have had to pay much higher stamp duty, a tax on that house purchase. So he got Laure to his partner to buy the house. But then if he provided the money to her to buy the house, then that would be have tax implications, because really it's he that's buying it, and it's him that's buying it, and it's in her name, but he provides the money to do that. He's still liable for the tax, the increased tax on the property purchase. So then people are now asking, well, where did you get 800 and whatever £1,000 from to buy that house? And he's like, oh, Laure's parents are really rich. And then there was an investigation and they're not rich at all. And then people are like, we still don't know where that money's come from. He's saying, no, it's all above board, etc., etc. So there's loads of questions over that. And that is a scandal that I think needs to be and it needs to be investigated even further. But then we have, this is the reference to the scandal to do with Laure Ferrari. So Farage's Brussels time bomb. Nigel Farage's partner, Laure Ferrari, faces a criminal fraud verdict in Brussels over alleged misuse of €730,000 in EU funds linked to his old Eurosceptic think tank, the Institute for Direct Democracy in Europe. Auditors refused to sign off the accounts back in 2016 after finding €218,000 unverified and suspicious donor arrangements, which they're starting to find with Reform UK as well. Reform UK are trying to change the rules so they can get loads of cryptocurrency donations, but also there seems to be some questions over donations with Reform. So anyway, the EU's anti-fraud office later referred the case to Belgian prosecutors. Now, after years of investigation, the court, Chamber 69 of the Brussels Tribunal, will deliver its final judgment on November the 5th. If Ferrari is found guilty, she could face large fines of up to €500,000, and Farage's image as a man who took on Brussels corruption collapses completely. He then becomes the very corruption that he was claiming was in the bureaucratic nightmare of Brussels, right, as far as he would see it. So again, you know, if he goes down on account of these associations or, you know, his actions, then Reform could well go down with him. We hear about funding for Reform. I talked about, you know, issues maybe with donors or donations. Amazing stories turned up in the Times where Reform UK has failed to pay VAT to the HMRC. So Her Majesty's, that's basically our tax unit on its sales, tickets and merchandise, about £400,000 in all. It's not tax avoidance, it's not tax evasion. They just didn't realise that when you sell stuff, you have to charge VAT, value added tax 20%. And yeah, so they've been selling, T-shirts, tickets or whatever, not paying VAT on them. And that has amounted to them owing £400,000 in tax. Again, you know, more controversy there. I guess they thought political parties were somehow exempt from tax. Nope. Political donations aren't taxable, but if a political party sells a baseball cap, the VAT is the same as when M&S do, which is a shop. They'll likely have to pay penalties. We can ballpark it. Given plausible VAT recovery and assuming Reform UK cooperate fully with the HMRC, expect a VAT bill in the region of £40,000 plus 3,000 penalties plus £3,500 interest. So that is not £400,000 bill, that's £400,000 of what they've sold, which that's how I would understand that. So we're not talking huge amounts, but it's a really basic error. And also, again, it shows you how unserious these people are. If that's a basic error, if you weren't trying to defraud the system, then you don't really know what you're doing. I mean, that is simple, basic accountancy. Yeah. And then we're going to go on. So this is actually mentioned in number 3 here, and I think this is super important. I'm tempted to say this would be something, if I was a political party against Reform, a route that I would go down. Now, at a conference in Birmingham in September, corporate advisors visiting Reform's get-together were impressed by their enthusiasm and energy, but all of them were concerned about the policy vacuum. Now we're seeing this vacuum being filled, and in a way which has already raised eyebrows. Within a matter of weeks, right-wing MP Danny Kruger, an anti-abortion Christian nationalist, has joined Reform and been given the role of working up Reform's policies for the next election. So he was a defector from the Conservative Party. He was quite a big player in the present Conservative Party. He went to Reform, but he's a Christian nationalist, anti-abortion guy. And it turns out that because that's where MAGA is in the US, broadly speaking, and they're importing a lot of that thinking into the UK, and you're starting to see Tommy Robinson do this kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Islam thing, getting into bed with Christian nationalism there. And the 2 speakers they had at the United Kingdom march were ardent Christo-fascists, I would say. You're starting to get a flavour in Reform that is uncomfortable for a lot of people in the UK. We're not a very religious country, and even if we are religious, we do it generally in private, less so in public. So this weekend, the theologian James Orr. Now, this was something I picked up on yesterday. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So Zia Yusuf announced, I'm delighted to welcome James Orr to Reform UK. James is a brilliant academic, theologian, thinker. He has been a bastion of common sense and patriotism at Cambridge University. I would say it's a little more controversial than that. He's not just a theologian, he's a pretty controversial one. He has become a close friend and is someone who I believe will have a pivotal role in shaping the future of this country. James is now a senior member of our team, a senior advisor to Nigel Farage, and he will bring even more talented patriots to the Reform family. Really proud to welcome James Orr. Okay. Here, though, the Independent points out that this weekend, the theologian James Orr, a similarly anti-abortion Christian nationalist, has formally joined the party and become Mr. Farage's advisor. The two highly intelligent men have seen the vacuum and perhaps an opportunity to shape a party with the sort of extreme social conservatism they believe in and is seen with Viktor Orban in Hungary. This is what Viktor Orban did in his rise to populist success and becoming an autocratic wannabe leader there. He has got into bed with Christian nationalism and Christian conservatism in Hungary, but that's something that I don't think has a broad sell in the UK. Now, not surprisingly, Orr considers asylum seekers arriving in the UK to be invaders. No surprises that both are close to the MAGA movement in the US and in particular Vice President JD Vance, who shares their views. While there is certainly a space for that sort of party in the UK, the question is whether it's a winning formula. The narrow perspective is unlikely to get the sort of broad appeal needed to win in the UK. So they can attract, maybe if they don't officially campaign on that, but they can attract all those sorts of people by those people knowing that you've got those thinkers in the party, your James Orrs and your Danny Krugers. But if this is part of their main party platform and agenda, then I think they're going to struggle in the UK, and that could present a bit of a problem. And then the last one, actually, let's just go back here to an excerpt from The Observer here. James Orr is an anti-abortionist. He believes in a male right to control women's bodies without their consent. His inclusion in Reform is another indication that they intend to use the same ethno-nationalist policies in the UK as used by the Trump administration in the US. The Observer says, on Monday, JD Vance hosted Danny Kruger, a Conservative MP, and James Orr, a religious philosopher influential in Reform UK, who share the Vice President's opposition to abortion. Orr does not think abortion should be allowed at any stage of fetal development, including those pregnancies resulting from rape. The interventions followed a rise over the past few years in donations from US Christian conservatives to UK networks that seek to stop women having access to abortion. An Observer investigation of funding patterns, protest materials, and so-called pregnancy crisis centres reveals a network of US-based organisations and a coordinated rise in funding from across the Atlantic to push back on British abortion rights. This is something to watch out for. This has been growing over the years. There's been money coming in, and we've seen this in Africa. This happens a lot in Africa, places like Uganda, where you've got conservative MAGA-aligned thinking. You've got churches over there giving a lot of money to sort of anti-gay movements in African nations like, as I say, Uganda, and the US does a good job of exporting this kind of thinking. Something to watch out for. We wouldn't expect that to be a case in the UK, but yes, it is. And then the last point in this independent article is an unsustainable coalition. So Reform is popular at the moment largely because the two traditional main parties, Labour and the Tories, are at historic low levels of support. But that 32% or so that they are consistently polling is made up of a very diverse group of voters. This goes back to the policy I was talking about. You know, your working class left wing unionized voter who doesn't like immigration against your right-wing Tory donor with millions of quid wanting to get low tax, low regulation. Okay, it's made up of a very diverse group of voters whose views often clash. In addition to that, about 10% of the people who either rarely or never vote, so cannot be relied upon to go to the polls. That's what I was talking about earlier. The experience of the Reform conference was enough to suggest that one set or other on the right and left of politics will be disappointed. At the conference, the Independent spoke to a former Tory donor, so a rich guy, in the network of super rich donors who once bankrolled the Conservatives, got fed up the Conservatives, see that the Reform I want to back a winner, I'm going to put my millions of quid in this party who is going to support my deregulation, right? So that's your voter. Then you got your working class guy from a northern town with a family of Labour voters going back generations, now going to Reform. He hailed a breath of fresh air. So this is a former Tory donor. Hailed a breath of fresh air and a party that would finally deregulate Britain to the sort of very low tax, zero employment rights, Singapore-style economy. But soon after, the Independent had a conversation with a Reform voter who is a tube train driver in London. Unlike the millionaire businessman, he was looking forward to Reform nationalising everything and raising taxes. In fact, he was a member of the RMT union and planned to go on strike the following day. So UK politics is used to broad churches and its main parties, but the gulf between these positions is unbridgeable. So those are all challenges that Reform will have to deal with one way or another. I think that last one's going to be very difficult in terms of writing a manifesto. I think they are unbridgeable positions, and so they have to really headline things like immigration that I think will draw together a lot of the people that will be voting for Reform. But those are some of the challenges. 3.5 years is a very long time. They need to prove themselves in office in local government as well as MPs, all the while, having Nigel Farage being untainted by scandals around him. It is a one-trick pony of a party, I think, in many regards, because I think Nigel Farage is Reform UK. And if he gets tainted, that is bad news for the rest of the party. But they do need to come up with that manifesto. There is a policy vacuum and there is a lack of governing expertise there. It all also goes back to Brexit as well. So these people are going to have to realise, both in local government and central government, that there isn't much money to play with. Right, partly because or largely because we are now out of the EU. How do they deal with that as the rhetoric is then ramped up over the next 3.5 years that maybe it's a good idea to rejoin? We are losing out huge amounts of money because we're not part of the EU. How does that jive with a party that's trying to grow, but also is essentially a Eurosceptic party? So interesting. Hopefully that gives you a better sense of what's going on. I try not to be too anti-reform there, but those are genuinely the issues that they're facing and the challenges that Nigel Farage and his party will have to overcome. Let me know what you think. Take care. Speak to you soon.